I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Robert Dunbar from Stanford University. So he is one of our nation's top chief scientists that have led many worldwide initiatives and has many decades of research experience in climate science. So I met him 3 years ago in one of his presentations, and I was so motivated and inspired to be part of the solution and make a change. He explained his very complex research in such a simple way that even I, as a kid, could understand. So please help me welcome Professor Dr. Robert Dunbar.
Hey, thanks. All right, I guess I think I'm wired for sound. Is it turned on? I guess you guys, I'm never accused of having a soft voice, put it that way. But yeah, Pavan, thank you very much. You're one of my heroes, given everything that you've done here. And you singing, that's amazing. You're so brave to get up in front of a crowd and sing like that. Well, thanks for having me here. You know, I've been working in the area of the environment in climate, ocean, ice areas for a long time. I've actually spent about 7 years of my life in the Antarctic. And I've probably spent another 5 years of my life working at sea. But, you know, I'm very green, and I've been green for a long time. But, you know, the funny thing is, when I think about the practices that we employ in our house, you know, composting and how we recycle, everything we do came first to me from my 2 kids, right? So it came from elementary school, from middle school, from high school, and the boys came home. And it's still happening today. You know, we just switched from a full-size trash bin to one of these half-size trash bins, and I think you maybe get a break on your garbage collection fee, but you know, it was the boys that made that happen. So I honestly do believe it's kids that are going to bail us out, right? And in so many different ways, that's going to happen. So I put my email address here because not only do I teach at Stanford, but I also teach every year in middle schools and high schools around the Bay Area. I've been teaching this year at Jefferson High School in South San Francisco, and I'm happy to come. You know, I try, if I get invited to come to a school, I can make it about 60% of the time. It depends on my travel schedule. And I also started this thing about 2 years ago where I give a lot of talks, and I just said, I will answer every email that people write me. Now, sometimes it's a very short answer, but I do write emails back. So from the youngest person here to the oldest person here, if you want to send a comment, a question, go ahead, and I will get back to you. It may not be instantly, but I will get back to you. Okay, so here we are, 10th of June, with this great conference today. And what you may not know, well, actually, how many people knew that we just had the World Oceans Day? Right? It was 2 days ago, and it was the 20th World Oceans Day. And I was struck by the theme, because the theme this year is youth, the next wave for change. You know, and again, it's kind of recognizing this theme that it's kids that are going to bail us out, right? You guys are going to be the ones that save the ocean. So I thought I'd make more of an oceans theme today and talk about some of the things that are going on in the ocean. I'm an oceanographer and a climate scientist. This is a map of the globe here, and it shows temperatures. The red there is where the oceans are very warm, and the blue is where it's very cold. And so you can see this huge area of the tropical ocean. It's bigger than all of North America. Right? And that's where heat is stored on the planet. In fact, a lot of the excess heat that's coming from man-made CO2 in the atmosphere, it's now in the ocean. The ocean it's like a big air conditioner, and it's just sucking heat out of the atmosphere. So my group, we've worked and published papers everywhere there's one of these gray dots. And I always take students in the field with me, right? I've taken over 70 students to the Antarctic. And that includes 2 students that were in high school, one Boy Scout, one Girl Scout, went with us to camp on the sea ice a number of years ago. But I've taken students to every one of these places. So if you're interested in doing field work related to the environment, there's many, many ways to do it, right? And you'll see some examples of this here. I got started in this in part because of my dad. That's my dad there. He was a sailor. Look at this. This is 1938. And he's in Samoa. And doesn't he look kind of like Mr. Spock from Star Trek? You know, like, it's incredible. Anyway, here he is. He's got this Samoan kid on his shoulders, and I was just fascinated by the places that he got to go. So I set a course in that direction myself. I am going to work in the field and I'm going to go places on the planet. And I've been trying to pay that forward. So I've got 2 sons, and I've been taking them as often as I can with me in the field. It was easy when they were in high school. It's a little bit harder when they're in college. But here's my son Ian in New Guinea, and he's made all these good friends there. And we were actually doing a little environmental project in Papua New Guinea. Okay, the oceans. A few fun facts about the oceans. They're really an important part of the planet. They cover over 70% of the Earth. They produce about half of all the oxygen that we breathe. The oxygen that we depend on and all animals on Earth. It's coming from plants, and about half of those plants are in the ocean. So, that's a really important thing that we don't think about very often. Half of our oxygen is coming from the sea. They act as the planet's air conditioner. We'll talk about that a little bit. They're the source of food for a lot of people. We're actually taking too much food out of the ocean right now. They're actually the source of much of our fresh water. When it rains here in California, that water always came from the oceans, right? That's where it started. And it's the home to cool animals like this big shark. I do a lot of work in the water with sharks, and I'll show you some video of those guys in a moment. Okay, so there's our planet. What's the main thing you see there? What strikes you? What's that? What color is it? Blue, yeah. They call it the blue marble, right? They don't call it the green marble. It's the blue marble. And it's spinning on its axis there. Lots of water in the oceans and lots of water in the atmosphere as well. All these white things there are clouds, water that's come out of the ocean. I kind of like this view from the Pacific side. Looking at the planet from this angle, you can hardly tell there's any land there at all, right? And we can learn some interesting things. The further away you go from shore, the more different the environment becomes. So at Stanford, we started a research station with some partners here at the Geographic Center of the Pacific Basin. And there's an island there, a very small coral atoll, and it's as far away from land as you can get, right? It's 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. It's extremely remote. This is what it looks like. Most of the time I sail in on ships. Sometimes we come in by airplane, but when you're landing here, it's a series of really flat islands, which is typical for a coral atoll, and there's a reef here, and the waves are breaking on the coral reef. And in this place, you see things that you really don't see in other parts of the tropics. There's more fish, the corals are healthy, they're growing fast, everything from the surface of the ocean down to the deep sea just looks healthy. It's vibrantly so. And we think the main reason it's so far away from anything, there's no people, there were never permanent villages or anything here, there's no fishing and no pollution. Here's how I usually get down there. I teach this class at Stanford every year. I take 23 students. It's a 140-foot tall ship, and we sail there from Hawaii. Can you imagine? And the students are the sailors. They learn how to run the sails and how to navigate. And they work really hard, but they get to sit around every now and then. We're fishing here. But after 12 days of sailing, you arrive at Palmyra in this peaceful lagoon, right? And the students that have been seasick, this is their favorite part of the voyage, is getting into calm water. And we get in the water right away, and this is what you see. I mean, that's a healthy coral reef. There's very few healthy coral reefs left on the planet. It's healthy because it's just 100% living coral. And there's a lot of different kinds of corals, lots of different species here. There's a lot of fish as well. When you jump in the water, that's what it looks like. That's an average day in the water at Palmyra. So what are these? What's that right there? A shark, yeah. So I actually take my 23 students and I throw them in the water. And sometimes, I showed this to some parents one time, and I didn't say anything about the sharks. I was just talking about the corals, and one of the parents said, "Is that a shark?" And I said, "Where?" Right? Now, you would imagine this is kind of dangerous. These are pretty big animals. They're all about 6 feet long. But they're all just plump. They're stuffed full of fish. The last thing in the world they would ever want to do is try to eat a person, right? We've had thousands of people in the water there and many thousands of hours of diving, and we've never had an incident. There's so much food there for everything that lives at the coral reef that the sharks, they're not interested in us at all. In fact, if you are 6 feet long and in the water, everybody thinks you're a shark. They treat us like we're sharks, right? So there's something about this. There's a lot of animals. The sharks are eating all these fish. The fish are eating things that damage the corals. It's this system in balance, right? It's how we think everything looked in the tropical ocean 1,000 years ago. here you can see some of the fish. These are big-eye trevally, jacks they're called, and here are the sharks swimming through. There's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of sharks and probably 10 million of these fish, all at this one little island. And we think it's really these fish here that are the key to keeping the corals healthy, right? So you come in fishing and take one animal out of this system, and then the whole region goes into decline. Now, it's not just the surface that looks healthy. I've been doing a lot of work in little submarines like this. This is a little 3-person submarine, and I've dove to the bottom of the ocean about 50 times now. I've made a lot of the first dives in the Central Pacific. These are kind of fun. We have 2 subs that we use, a little white one and a yellow one. And 3 of us get inside this ball. It's like 3 6-foot-tall people getting inside a basketball and living there for the day. That's what we do. So here's the submarine. It's getting launched off of this big ship now, and we're going down. That's the view from the inside. So we're packed in there. We're looking at the world through a tiny, tiny porthole, and that's what you see. The only time I ever get seasick is when I'm in that submarine at the surface bouncing around, and that always does me in. Submarine's sinking now. Sometimes it takes 2 hours to get down to the bottom of the ocean, but here we are at the bottom of the sea, and now exploring the bottom of Palmyra, the walls of this undersea mountain that come up to make that coral atoll. We have a little basket here that we use to carry samples. Every trip we make, we discover new species, sometimes a new genus of animal, and they're not insects like you find in the Amazon. I mean, we find new species that are 10 feet tall, that kind of thing. So these are deep sea corals. And they're very healthy there, too. They're surviving on food that's falling down from above. So Palmyra, that sunlit part where all the corals and sharks are, that's this giant food production factory, and it supports life throughout huge areas of the deep ocean. Look at this deep sea coral. It looks like a pig's tail, right? Except it's 20 feet long. These things are all over the place. And you see big animals, too. That's a 15-foot great white shark. These things are fascinated by the submarine. It's the closest I've ever been to a great white shark, and there was a lot of steel between him and me. So lots of animals live in the deep sea. Here's a very rare shark, the Cook shark. We labeled this place, we called it Jurassic Park, because every time we touched down on the bottom in the submarine, these huge Cook sharks came over. And there's the end of the dive. And one of the things, when we're done talking, I mean, maybe I'd say, come up and check this thing out. This is a deep sea coral that we collected from Palmyra, right? And this is just the tip of a branch. This was a tree that was about 30 to 40 feet high, and we took small samples from it, and we have different ways to figure it out, but that tree's been growing in that one spot for 8,000 years. These are some of the oldest organisms on the planet, right? And it means they've been living in a place where they're sustained by food and perfect conditions for them for a long, long time. So it might be kind of fun for you to come up and check something like that out afterwards, and I can answer questions about it as well. Okay, let's keep going here. So here's the deep sea coral. Everything looks healthy on these remote islands, on the surface and all the way down deep. And, well, we can still find parts of the ocean that look good. That's the good news. But, I mean, it's only about 1% of the ocean that still looks good. Most of the ocean's actually in trouble, and there's too many human impacts. But we can do things about it, as Pavan said, for things that you can do in schools and things we can do on our homes here. I mean, there are things we can do in the ocean. We can certainly be more efficient about how we use the ocean. And this is my kind of paradigm for efficiency. This is a fisherman in West Papua. It's the Indonesian part of New Guinea. And look at his sail. So what has he made his sail out of? Umbrellas, yeah. I mean, that's great recycling, right? I mean, I can't imagine how you would figure out how to sew them together in the right shape, but he figured it out. So, they're making use of everything because they don't have the resources to buy much that's new, right? Okay, so how are the oceans involved in climate change? I know a lot of you know about the greenhouse effect already. I mean, we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and we've known that causes the atmosphere to warm up. We've known that for a century now. But what we've recently realized is that most of the extra heat from man-made carbon dioxide, it's actually going into the ocean. And that has a whole bunch of follow-on effects like the melting of ice. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the other thing that's going on is that besides absorbing the heat of global warming, the oceans themselves are absorbing carbon dioxide, right? The gas that's coming from the burning of fossil fuels. Now that's actually, if you think about it, that in many ways that's a good thing. If the oceans were not breathing in all of this extra CO2, more of it would stay in the atmosphere and the planet would warm up that much faster, right? So it's partly a good thing, but we also don't know what it's going to do to the animals and plants that live in the oceans. And that's a huge research target that's going on right now. And I mention it because I went to the website for this conference last year, and I looked at the videos that were there and the exhibits, and I saw you guys had some exhibits on ocean acidification, right? And that's what this is all about, trying to understand what happens. So this is a photograph from several months ago in Australia. It's partly my lab group, and we've set up, we've taken things from our laboratory out into the field, set them up on the coral reef, and here's a little tank where we're growing things, and there's a couple of fish in there, and we're adding carbon dioxide to simulate the world of the future. And we're just starting to figure out, how are these plants and animals going to change? Another way we do that is by drilling into some of these ancient coral colonies. This is a big coral colony at Easter Island. It's 800 years old, and we know that because we counted the growth bands. I'll show you pictures of that in a moment. But we have this underwater drill rig, and we take these cores. They're cylinders of limestone, because these big colonies of colonial animals, they're building their skeletons out of limestone. And so here we are drilling into this thing. We do this about once a year. We'll go out to a different part of the Pacific and do a project like this. So here's the drill system, and then you can see some of the coral cores right here. So these are the samples that we bring back to the lab. And when we do so, they look like this. This is one of those cylinders of limestone, a big block of limestone that we've sliced up, and then you can see annual growth bands. Sometimes you can see it with your eyes. In this case, it's been x-rayed. But here we go. It's this one stopped growing in 1995. There's a dark and a light band every year, so you can just count these bands on down to the base. That's how we know that coral's about 800 years old at Easter Island, is by counting those bands. Now, the other thing we can do is we can simply measure the weight of skeleton that's accumulated every year. And one of the things we're starting to see is that the last 20 years or so, these guys are growing more slowly. So there's a chance, that's an early response to ocean acidification. That's one of the things that we're looking at now. So the skeletons of these organisms tell us what's happened in the past. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about was how the oceans act as this global air conditioner. Here's Antarctica. Here we are in California. It's kind of a funny map of the globe, but it's done this way to show how the ocean currents move heat around. The ocean currents tend to take heat from the tropics and deposit that heat in the poles. Here in Antarctica, we'll take a look at Antarctica in just a moment, but it's actually causing parts of Antarctica to warm up a lot more than the rest of the planet's warming up. So I think we can get this started. Yeah, there we go. So here's a little animation from NASA. It shows, it's kind of a cartoon, but it shows surface currents here. So here's warm water coming up from the equator. It's the Gulf Stream now. It goes up near Greenland and helps melt some of the Greenland ice. And then it releases heat to the atmosphere, and then the cold water sinks into the deep sea. It sinks into these canyons and valleys in the deep ocean, and then it starts flowing south. So we call this thing the Great Ocean Conveyor of Heat. So here's the heat coming north at the surface, and then cold water sinking and moving through the deep ocean basins to the south. And that's going on all the time, right? And I mean, it's this system that's going to control our greenhouse future, because the excess heat ends up in the ocean and it perturbs the circulation of the ocean. So here are the deep currents now. They're going around Antarctica. They're going to be a big loop-de-loop here in the Indian Ocean, but most of the flow at the surface is circumpolar around Antarctica. It's one of the reasons that that place stays so cold, is that kind of crazy flow. So look at this funny loop here, right? And it's a cartoon, but generally, that's what it looks like. The ocean has these massive rivers running through it that move heat from one part of the planet to another. So one of the places that's receiving heat this way is West Antarctica. So here's the South Pole. I do a lot of work in this area, McMurdo Station and along this part, but we're mainly focusing on the Antarctic Peninsula, the part of Antarctica that moves up towards South America. And that place is warming up at about 8 times faster, a faster rate than the rest of the planet, right? So super fast heating. And that's affecting the animals that live there. So what animals do you see here? What are these guys? Penguins. Everybody likes penguins, right? So, you know, the Antarctic Peninsula has the largest number of penguins on the planet. It's somewhere, you know, on the order of 100,000, maybe 150,000 birds in a fairly small area. They live in these vast colonies. There can be individual colonies with 1 million birds, right? And it's a pretty small area. You wouldn't even believe what it smells like. But they're very comical. They're fun to watch. Look at them all here. That's called porpoising, how they swim through the water. And they're feeding here. Every now and then they have to take a break and they jump out on the ice floe. But this particular kind of penguin, the Adelie penguin, you know, they need sea ice. They have to have sea ice in order to be successful with everything they do. And so what's happening in this part of the Antarctic now is that sea ice is melting earlier. And so the penguins have to move south. And they have to keep moving south. And you know what? There's only so far south they can go before they run out of ice altogether. So, you know, we've already seen major changes in the distribution of penguins like these Adelies in Antarctica over the last 30 years from this large amount of warming. So it's actually a pretty big deal. This is a balmy summer day, by the way, the middle of January, which is the middle of summer in Antarctica. And you can see what the penguins deal with in summer. Imagine what it's like in winter, right? But they're fat little birds. They're able to use their body fat to stay warm. Okay, so how do we study climate change in the Antarctic? We do a lot of things. I work on this ship every year. I've got a 2-month cruise on this ship coming up in January. And so we have different coring systems. Here we are out on the ice. This is New Year's Eve, a couple of years ago, by the way. And here's a little Adelie penguins coming over to check us out. Sometimes we core from the ice shelf itself. So this is a vast floating glacier. It's the size of France, right? It's bigger than California. It's a vast floating glacier. And the ice here, this is about 300 foot tall, and the ice goes down over 1,200, 1,500 feet into the sea. Sometimes we drill through things like this. And when we do that, we use a rig like this. This is a big drill rig. There's a little tractor for scale. And it's covered in a tent so that we can keep the drillers warm. You know, drillers are a very delicate group of individuals. So here's the drill rig on the inside of that tent. And here's some of the drillers operating this thing. And the cores come up from below that big floating ice, and we work on them right away. And this is, again, one of the places that, you know, when I'm involved, I take students into the field with me. Right? I'll take 2 or 3 different students into the field, and we work on these cores together. So here's what's cool about that spot. I mean, it's pretty basic. It's pretty easy to understand. We don't need any fancy instruments to understand what's happening here. This is some of that core material that's come up from the seabed. We've used a big drill and drilled into the seabed, and the core comes up and it looks like this. And there's really 2 kinds of sediment or rock when it's hard. And this kind, it's layered, it's kind of greenish yellow, and it's made up entirely of microscopic plants. Entirely. In fact, the plants look like this. These are diatoms. They're little shells of microscopic algae, the base of the food chain in the ocean. And so these guys need light. So you know when you find them, there was open water overhead, right? The other kind of sediment looks like this. It's full of gravel, boulders, cobbles, sand. You know, you only get that when there's a big glacier around. So we see this alternation between plants, boulders, gravel, sand, plants, boulders, gravel, sand. So the cartoon's like this. Here we are drilling in our tent on top of this huge floating glacier. And we went through 1 kilometer of water, and then we drilled into this sequence. It's alternating between plants, gravel, sand, rocks, things that indicate glaciers, open water glaciers, open water glaciers. You know, that's how we know about the heartbeat of Antarctica. You know, the glaciers come, the glaciers melt, the glaciers form, the glaciers melt. And so we can track that. And what we've learned is that, Antarctica's ice sheet, it can melt pretty fast. Parts of it can melt in just a couple of centuries, right? I mean, we know that by looking at the last 40 times that it melted. And we also know that in the last several million years, when it's melted over and over and over again, it's because there have been natural changes in temperature only on the order of 2 to 4 degrees centigrade, right? And that is what we predict for the next 60 or 70 years. So, I mean, based on this, it's going to melt, right? Sea level is going to rise. We don't see any evidence that the Earth can accommodate that kind of temperature rise without seeing parts of Antarctica melt, right? So that's one of the things we're really worried about. So I'm finishing up here. I just wanted to, a couple of points, things to remember from today. I mean, the oceans are warming. The oceans are absorbing this heat, man-made heat, but they're also keeping the land cooler, right? They help air condition the planet. They're also taking up some of the man-made CO2, which is a good thing, but it's also bad because it's probably doing things to the ocean that aren't very healthy for the ocean. We already know that it's causing some of the ice to melt and oceans are rising, sea levels are rising now. I didn't talk too much about this, but it is clear we're taking too many fish from the sea, And when you take the wrong fish, it has this really bad effect on places like coral reefs or the surrounding environment. But it's not too late. I mean, it's the kids here. You guys are going to be the ones that help bail us out. And there are a number of things you can do. Certainly, what you do on land, everything you keep out of the landfill, the more composting you do, the more recycling you do, that helps the ocean. It's so direct, it's so immediate, because a lot of stuff we throw away on land ends up in the ocean, right? So everything you do with the Green Schools program and thinking about sustainability, it helps the ocean, even though you may not realize it directly. You can learn about the sea, and we've got a lot of different ways to do that with the aquarium here, Monterey Bay Aquarium. If you want, I'll come talk to your classes about things in the ocean, animals that live in the ocean. Plastics are a big one, using fewer plastics, and then eating the right kinds of seafood. So I'm a big fan of Seafood Watch, where they say, it's okay to eat this fish because it's sustainable, right? It's not hurting the ocean. But these other fish, maybe not. So the last thing I'll say, I'm a climate scientist. We certainly don't know everything there is to know about climate science. I mean, there are uncertainties, but I think this is a good way to look at it. This is a puzzle where not all the pieces are in place, but what is that? What's the picture?
A tiger.
Yeah, it's a tiger, right? But we don't have all the pieces filled in yet. But you can still tell it's a tiger, right? So, I mean, that's how we think about climate change. We don't know all the answers yet, but you know what? We've got a pretty good idea where we're going. And so, it's good to have dialogue and talk about uncertainties, but we also kind of know which way we're going. So I'll stop there. I took this picture in Alaska last year. It's 2 adolescent grizzly bears in Geographic Harbor, and we all need the sea. I mean, you think about these grizzly bears in Alaska, their diet is almost 100% from the ocean, right? They eat clams for a couple of months until the salmon start running, and then they eat salmon. So, I mean, we're all dependent upon the sea in so many ways. So I'll stop there. It's just before noon, and I'm happy to answer questions now, but also I'm going to stick around for a while. I invite you to come up and touch this ancient organism from the oceans, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very informative. Thank you very much, and we all enjoyed it. Anybody wants to come here and touch the coral, see the coral? Okay.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, form a line, please, so we'll take turns. Do you have any questions? Form a line, please, here, so we could show.
Yeah, so there it is. Look at that. It looks, it doesn't, it looks like plastic, doesn't it? But it's not. That's what this coral builds its skeleton out of. 8,000 years old. Imagine. Have you ever seen anything like that? It looks like a tree, doesn't it? I know. That's just how they grow. It's pure protein. So pure protein. They make jewelry out of this stuff in Hawaii. That's called the black coral. They can They carve little Buddhas out of it. It's very smooth, isn't it? Smooth and shiny.
It looks like steel.
It does, doesn't it? It looks very strong, you know, but it's pretty flexible. It's super shiny. It's very smooth. It's pretty strong stuff. Yeah, it's very valuable too. This piece is